Hello, and thank you for having me today. My name is Doni Aldine, and I'm here to speak to you about what exactly is culture and why does it matter. It's such a pleasure and an honor to speak to you, and I can't wait to dive in. We'll spend the next 30, 45 minutes or so talking about why it's important to understand the variables of culture and how it makes a difference in our everyday lives. So I'm the editor in chief of Cultures Magazine. You see some of them in the background behind me. Cultures is a global multicultural magazine, and we're part of a global multicultural philanthropic lifestyle network. Our goal is to create or enhance community and create belonging for people who straddle culture, race, ethnicity, nation, and or location. I know that might sound strange to some of you. It doesn't for the people who do. Now let me explain that a little bit. People who straddle race, so you may be biracial, multiracial, culture, of course, cross-cultural, multicultural. Actually, all of these identities are cross-cultural, and we focus on cross-cultural identity. Um, Culture, race, ethnicity. So I'm Afro-Latina, so that's a straddling of ethnicity. And many consider race to be a straddling of ethnicity as well, because race is not really a construct. Nation. So I happen to have grown up on 4 continents in 7 cultures. So you could see right there, you straddle nations when you're globally mobile like that. And location. So people like military brats who often are domestically mobile within one country. So you may be born in Maine and move to Louisiana, end up in California, and who knows, start a career when you're older meaning an adult, in let's say Colorado. Those are 4 distinct cultures within the United States. And each one teaches you different things. You learn different things by being part of those cultures, and it shapes who you are, it shapes your identity. The importance of what we'll talk about today is the forming of identity between or before age 18, actually. I was going to say between, but before age 18. And when you have these geographic or these mobility shifts, it makes it more difficult to decide who you are. It makes it harder to be culturally balanced. So you learn to deal with change. And that change is like growing up with a foundation of beach sand instead of a foundation of cement, like many monocultural people have. So when you talk about being cross-cultural, and in terms of Cultures Magazine, again, straddling culture, race, ethnicity, nation, or location, it makes a big difference to make sure that you feel a sense of belonging with the people who are around you. People who grow up with this mobility, we call it cultural fluidity, when they're able to shift back and forth, and they have multiple identities that come into one to create who they are. Often they understand a lot of people around them, and the people around them may not understand them as much because their dimensionality is much more expanded. They've been different places, they've grown up learning different things, and we'll talk about that more in depth in just a few seconds. So I'm editor-in-chief of this philanthropic lifestyle magazine. And again, our intent is to create belonging for people who are in between or who straddle those different parts of their identities. Now, I told you that I grew up on a number of different places and on a number of continents. I'm Afro-Latina, and that's a big part of my identity. That's also what led me to doing the research and teaching a class on this at university. I teach at Colorado State University, and it's really interesting when people come from a monocultural background. It's very difficult sometimes just to understand how someone who has a broader depth or dimensionality thinks and why they think the way they do. So hopefully I can explain a little bit of that today. Having grown up in Turkey and Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. My dad is Costa Rican, my mom is Trinidadian. Uh, went to college in Germany. I feel like I'm forgetting one in there. And then, of course, the United States, multiple states in the United States changed how I saw the world. And it wasn't until I came to university and had to deal with African American culture on a different level that I had culture shock. So here I'd been in all these countries with all shades of people and everything was fine. And then I came to the United States. Well, not to the, I came to the United States when I was young. Actually, I was born here. I was born in New York City. And at 2 weeks, I moved to Trinidad and Tobago and then started my journey to where I am now. So in undergrad, however, I had 200 people out of a university of about 25,000. And those 200 are the ones who gave me culture shock because I'd never seen culture in this manner. I had to learn what it looked like. I had to really figure out the parts of culture that you see every day. So the clothes, the food, the sayings, how people thought. But then I had to decipher what that meant underneath. And that's more important in terms of what culture is. So why does that matter? Why does it matter to understand people who are that way? Well, the broader you can have an understanding, the more empathetic you could be with others, the more our communication hits the mark. And when we say things, people understand what we mean, and we will have fewer miscommunications. So let's jump into it a little bit. I'm going to share my screen, and we will talk about the cultural iceberg. So surface culture, as I just mentioned, it's all about the food and, maybe the flags for your nation, nationality, festivals you may have, fashion, holidays, music, performances, dance, games, arts and crafts, literature, and even language, right? Those are the things that we think about when we think about culture. It's what I call low-hanging fruit. For my university students, often when they're struggling to try to understand, again, when you come from a monocultural identity and you're struggling to understand, what does this mean? How do I write journalistic articles for Cultures Magazine that really talk to this audience, really speak to this audience, connects with them on a deeper level? So the surface level is to talk about food and flags and festivals and language, right? That's easy. Anyone can do that, right? Again, low hanging fruit. But deep culture is much more than that. It's how you communicate. It's the styles and rules of communication. It's facial expressions, if you could believe it or not, gestures, eye contact. In some cultures, if you look directly at an elder, that's disrespectful when you're younger. In other cultures, you're considered shifty if we can't look them in the eye. So knowing who you're speaking with and why they're reacting the way they do is really important for intercultural communication, for communication in general. Knowing someone's background helps you communicate with them so that you create understanding. Personal space is another one. Going to Asia, it's so interesting because space is at a premium. So sometimes even when you're on a train, you're jammed up together, there's no personal space. Whereas in the Western world, it's like, hey, why are you in my space, right? That seems rude. You're too close to me. Whereas in Asia, it's just what it is because there's not as much space, and other reasons as well. Touching and how touching is seen, body language, how we stand, how we move. Some cultures are very expressive and others are very reserved. And when you interact with one that's the opposite of what you are or different than what you are, you may make some quick judgments about those people and why you think they're doing the things they're doing. That's not always necessarily the way it goes, because if their culture has taught them to be expressive while yours has taught you to be reserved, then you'll have some misunderstanding. You may think someone is angry or upset or too emotional when they're expressive. And you may think someone is cold when they're reserved. On the flip side, conversational patterns in social situations, who speaks, when they speak, how often, it's all very different depending on where you come from. Displaying emotion. Wow, one thing I love about certain cultures with men is how very, very masculine men can be so emotional and loving to their families and their children, whereas in other cultures, that's seen as weak. In the United States right now, the president speaks about that and what he thinks is weak. And many people have judgments about what that means. And then your tone of voice. You might hear terms like tone policing. In some cultures, what's seen as angry is just passion in other cultures. It's really interesting, and I'm sure you've heard those words in African American culture, especially in the context of the United States. Now, other things that are part of deeper culture, the more important things, the more salient things in culture are notions of courtesy and manners. How many times have you heard someone say, "Oh, they were rude," right? I hear this a lot about Parisians. One of my students in my class the other day said, "Well, no one likes the French anyway," which, is not true, But often, or even you hear this about people coming from big cities, right? "Oh, New Yorkers are rude. Japanese or people from Tokyo are rude." Think about what big city life is like. Think it through. It may be very different than rural or suburban life. And people act accordingly. That's the culture. And so often that's what they grew up with, and that's what's ingrained with them. That's what they've learned how to interact with the world around them. And that's the importance of culture. You learn this and it keeps you balanced. We'll get to that in just a second. How you make and keep your friends. That's a huge part of culture. Often there's miscommunication with how friendship is and what the expectations are. And culture is a big part of that. How modest you are. Oh goodness, going to school in Europe is eye-opening when you come from a place like the United States that many see as very puritanical. Or I don't know if you know, or if you're old enough to know, back when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, he had a little hiccup with a young intern. And many in the US, well, in US culture, that's considered a no-no. But in other cultures in Europe, they thought, well, what's the problem? This is normal, right? Again, and again, with the modesty, maybe that's not a great example for modesty. Well, it kind of is. But also with modesty, if you go to Europe, you'll see a lot of nude beaches, topless beaches. When you watch television, it's a lot more risque than what's in the US. And it's so funny because they often look at people in the US and think that we're so, I don't know, what's the word, that you're not lewd. It's just the same as alcohol because it's so many years before we can drink alcohol in the United States, whereas in a lot of European countries, you can have it when you're much younger. And then you see our young people as they get older, they binge on alcohol. And that's not something that I ever did. And I don't think I ever had, well, I know I never had the urge to, because as I was growing up, it was available to me. So, there's that notion of what's kept away from you is what you dream about and what you want. So you hit 18 or 21, depending on where you live, and all of a sudden you just go on a binge. So, notions like that, culture is really important for that. Notions of beauty. We even see this a little bit between different ethnicities. What's beautiful versus what's not. My hair in recent times when I was younger, I don't know that this hair would have been accepted in the workplace. Even today, it's pushing boundaries to do that. but I choose to do that because to me, it's beautiful. So concepts of who you are, yourself, of time, of the past and future, of fairness and justice, things and roles related to your age, your gender, class, and family, they're very different depending on your culture. Respect for elders tends to be really something important in other cultures. For instance, in my mother's Trinidadian culture, my youngest brothers grew up the fewest years in Trinidad and Tobago. My older brother and I, we're well steeped. We lived in Trinidad often and for a long time each time we went. And we understand what that culture is about. And my mother was very much ingrained in this culture, even though she's what's called a third culture kid. So let's go off to that for just a second. We're an adult third culture kid. A third culture kid is someone who during their formative years has grown up in where they were geographically mobile. They could be a domestic third culture kid, so they're geographically mobile within one country, or a global nomad. They were geographically mobile around the world. And so I'm an adult third culture kid. It turns out my mother, who's a United States immigrant, and my father as well, they both were adult third culture kids, or are. My father's passed away now, but my mother's still here. And so cultures, again, straddling culture, race, ethnicity, nation, or location, we focus on third culture kids and other cross-cultural people who have these identities. So in Trinidad and Tobago, it's very important you pay attention to your elders. If you go down the street and somebody sees you do something, oh, you can imagine when you get home, your auntie, your mom, your mom knows what you've done. So don't do anything that you don't want to have come back to them. It really was the concept of it takes a village. Everyone watched out for everyone else, and you respected all elders. My mother has some stories where that didn't work in her favor. People sometimes can take advantage of you because they know as an elder you will listen. Someone had stolen some very expensive items from her when she was a child, and she came home and asked her aunties, why did you have this person come and get this from me? And they said, well, we didn't. So there's downsides to that as well. But the point is that with culture, that's very different. Whereas in the United States, we often teach people, stranger danger and stay away, which, when you have a larger country and different cultural rules, it makes sense why they're that way. All right. So attitudes toward elders, toward adolescents, toward dependents, your roles, your expectations, what you do at work, how authority works, and who is authoritative, cooperation versus competition, relationships with animals, that's a big one. Think about it, loving your dog and how in the United States we treat our animals versus other countries that often think we're a little bit loopy. What age means, what sin is, and the difference between life and death. Dia de los Muertos is coming up in Mexico, Day of the Dead. And in the United States, often it's conflated with Halloween. It's really an honorable holiday for those who have passed on. And often we have our own take on that, and we bring it in and do something different with it. So finally, deep culture also includes approaches to religion, to courtship, or how you meet and marry your spouse. Our next issue of Cultures, I'm so excited, has a Filipino Kenyan family who started dating after they got married. It was an arranged marriage, and they fell deeply, deeply in love because it was based on compatibility and on values rather than love. So they didn't start with the love. The parents thought these two wonderful people would be great spouses, and they didn't. It's such a fantastic story. I hope you all get that issue. That will come out at the beginning of 2021. But they now have 3 children, and they're deeply, deeply in love. I find it a fascinating story. But in the United States, arranged marriage is seen as something that's a little bit crazy. So, again, cultural differences. Raising children. And often, actually, in the US, you see that. So it's called a melting pot in the United States. Some people don't necessarily see that. Some people call it a tossed salad. Some people see it as, cold cheese that was melted and just layered upon each other. But when often people divorce because of differences in values, that may be rooted in culture, right? How are we going to raise children? How do we act toward each other? What are our roles in this marriage? Who does what? And how is it seen? Do we judge people for that because they think differently than we do? That's a huge difference in culture. How you make decisions and solve problems, those are differences too. So what's interesting is people who grow up straddling culture, race, ethnicity, nation, or location, again, they tend to have a broader breadth. They are more culturally fluid. And so they tend to have understanding of a wider range of things because they've experienced those things. Unfortunately for them, they often are not the recipient of the same amount of understanding, because if someone has a narrower cultural dimensionality, then it's difficult to understand something that's outside of yourself, right? So it's a difference between IQ, or intelligent quotient, and EQ, or emotional quotient. So EQ is what most of the CEOs of the largest corporations around the world possess. Many would think it's IQ, that you just need to be smarter, be the smartest guy in the room. Well, in actuality, it's the person who can read the room that really can lead people, feel, engage the culture around them, and make lasting change. It's vision that can't just be imbibed with intelligence. So IQ is about balanced performance and decision making, whereas EQ is about self-awareness, motivation, self-management, social skills, and empathy. So again, that broader dimensionality helps you be more empathetic to other people, helps you understand where they're coming from, even if you don't necessarily come from that place. Helps you emotionally connect with others who may or may not be like you. And then that transforms to social skills, especially if you are good at self-management, if you're able to interact in situations that are different than the culture that you grew up with or what your expectations are. You're able to mold to how others are different. Oprah Winfrey is excellent at this. One of the things that that Oprah does, and it's often attributed not to her, but in neuro-linguistic programming, that you mirror the person who's next to you. Oprah does this automatically. It's one of the ways that she connects with her audience, with the people that she's interviewing with. So they lean forward, she leans forward. They have an accent, all of a sudden she has an accent. And many people think it's an affect, that it's just a ploy. But people who are very empathetic automatically absorb these things. I know for me, when I was younger, I used to hate it. I used to hate that I would absorb other people's traits. I'm like, why can't I just be myself? But as I got older, I was able to switch back and forth, right? Because some of those traits would become part of me. You see best friends or families that have the same mannerisms. They may finish each other's sentences because they act the same. They've been around each other. They can empathize. They know what's happening next. Now, the thing about EQ and IQ, balancing that creates cultural balance. It's an almost unconscious knowledge of how things are and how they work in a particular community. And what's important about that is your relationship and your place in that community. So when you have that awareness, you feel balanced, and it provides a sense of belonging. So people who grow up third culture may not, they have a harder time getting that cultural balance. If you're constantly moving from place to place, you have to start over again, that beach stand instead of the foundation of cement. Well, now in the age of COVID, well, there's a lot of gifts and a lot of challenges in growing up with cultural fluidity, with especially with a lot of cultural fluidity. There are 13 dimensions of fluidity, and I personally have 10 of them. Barack Obama, as an example, has 9 of them. That's one of the reasons I believe that many world leaders related to him, because he had that sense of understanding. Even though they didn't know him before he came into office, they're already excited for him to be there, right? The way he carried himself, how he listened, how he spoke, signaled to them that here's someone who would understand. So when you have that many dimensions, and 9 or 10 is a lot. Did I say that Barack Obama has 9? He has 9 out of the 13, which is a lot. It gives you greater understanding of other people. And fewer people get you to your core, because wow, if you have that breath, but then someone else only has 1 or 2 dimensions of cultural fluidity, of culture, right? Then wow, it's difficult for them to think outside of themselves to understand where you're coming from. So the unfortunate part for people like me is that you have to do more work for the cultural understanding. And hopefully you'll keep an inner circle around you that helps with that cultural balance, so that you're not constantly on the outs doing the work. People who are biracial, multiracial, multicultural have similar issues. They can understand, for instance, if you're a mixed race identity, you understand both sides. You understand multiple sides. If you're a multi-ethnic, multicultural, your father, like in my case, my dad's from Costa Rica, my mom's from Trinidad and Tobago, I can understand those 2 cultures to an extent, and neither one of them really understand me. They see me as a Yankee. However, when I'm in the United States, I don't get that full understanding here either. So I'm always the one that has to extend myself to have understanding of others. And then unfortunately, it's a rare occasion that I get that full understanding back. So the cultural balance is important because it provides a sense of belonging. And if you remember at the beginning, that is what I said about Cultures Magazine. We enhance belonging for these in-between identities, because it's not something that we always experience in the outside culture. So this is one of the reasons culture is important. This is one of the reasons that it might affect you. It affects communication. It affects everyday life. Think to yourself, who is in your life that it will help your relationship or your communication to think a little bit more about where they're coming from, rather than what you know to be the culture, what you've learned unconsciously about how things work around here, how you relate to the surrounding culture. Think about someone in your life that you could have a little more empathy for. So let's walk into what that really looks like. So when you see a foreigner, sometimes it's fairly obvious. They may look different, they may dress differently, they definitely think differently, and they speak differently. And often we will give them what I call a pass. We'll let that slide because we know they're different, right? Versus someone who's adopted, let's say an international adoptee. They might look different, but they grew up in the same culture that you did, so they think like you and they speak like you. A hidden immigrant, which is what I am, and many third culture people are, they might look like you, not always, but in the United States, there's many people who consider me African American. I look like them, but I'm Afro-Latina Caribbean and from the United States, right? I look like you, but then you start talking to me and now you're perplexed because why do you think like that? I don't think like you. You think differently. You might speak alike as I do, so that makes it even harder to understand. After I tell you I'm Afro-Latin Caribbean, people may say, oh, well, okay, that makes sense. And then they hear my US accent and they think, oh, no, she's African American. You switch right back because you already have that cultural balance of knowing what the world is like around you. So where do I fit in that though? Because when I go to the next country, I speak differently. As a matter of fact, when I'm talking, often my accents get muddled. I've grown up in so many places. As I get older and the longer I stay in the United States, it's not as much of an issue. But sometimes words come out all wonky and people think, wait, why did you say that like that? It's because I've had so many accents. And if I'm talking on the phone to someone who has an accent from where I came, one of the places that I've lived, all of a sudden my speech patterns change. And you think, what's happening with you? The last is the mirror, which is what we're used to, what we expect in the world around us. These are people who look like us, so they dress and they have social norms like we do. They think like us and they speak like us. This is our expectation. The toughest of all of these, because the foreigner we might give a pass. The mirror, of course, is mostly like us, so we get them. But those who are adopted and those who are hidden immigrants, as third culture people, they have a tougher time because they have a further breadth of experience and they may not get the path that someone else would. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. All right. So I hope you have understood what culture is and why it's important in your life. You know, in African American culture, and I say African American culture because I come from a number of Black cultures around the world. And Black people from other places who come to the United States, to the United States, very much maybe, or I shouldn't say maybe, most likely they're hidden immigrants. And so the expectation is that they'll be like you, and often they're not. Again, if they have an accent or they dress differently, they get a pass. Someone like me may not. And it's complicated, right? Because I'm actually from here, but I'm from there too. I'm from 3 places and I lived in 7 places. So where do I fit? The more we can extend ourselves to try to understand those that are different than we are, the better communication we all can have together and the more we can move forward together. So one of the things cultures does, for instance, we have these African American princess cards. They're affirmation cards. Oops, this one's upside down. And I am myself. There's 52 of them. So you can reinforce I am strong, your self-love and your identity every day. This one says, I am allowed to enjoy my desires. So these were the brainchild of LaShonda Gatson. You saw the cover of this particular issue. This is one of the African American princesses. And so she imagined what she wanted to see in the dominant culture when she was a child. African American culture is a culture. I don't consider it a race. That's why I call myself Black, and I'm Afro-Latin because that is a cultural reference, right? Again, we talked about race is just a social construct, but in the dominant culture in the United States, we're used to seeing faces that don't necessarily look like this, right? So LaShonda came up with princesses, 14 of them, who she imagined into gemstones and how she would have liked to see the world when she was a child. And these affirmation cards have been created to help uplift that identity. Again, when you're in a culture that may not have the beauty standards, the communication standards, the understanding of our community that we want them to have. So we're almost out of time. I want to give you some takeaways. So the real things that you can use in your everyday life that show why culture is important and makes a difference in how you perceive and communicate with others and how they may interact with you. So one is to know your history. In our Time for Change issue, I've shown you that cover. we did an exploration of what is Blackness, very much for what I talked to you about. I'm going to show you another one. Again, I'm Afro-Latin, and this is one of my favorite issues, Shades of Latin. As you can see, there are many different shades of Latin. It goes from the lightest light to the darkest dark, but that's not typically what you think of when you think of Latina or of a Latino, right? Either. But we need to know that there are many shades. And so in our exploration of Blackness and our Time for Change issue, which came out this summer to celebrate and to uplift with the new social civil rights movement, we wanted to show what Blackness looked like around the globe, all different levels of cultural dimensionality. People who came from different places, went to different places, had different points of view, mixed culture identity, blended ethnicity identity, all cross-cultural, all with something to say. And within that, there was a Nigerian immigrant who lived in the United States, and their children were born here. And that person had said, over the time that they lived in the US, they learned about African American history, and that completely changed their point of view. So again, know your history. Why is it important it changed their point of view? Because now they had an understanding of African American culture from a different level. They could see why things are the way they are in the United States for Black people versus the culture they'd come from. And the quote that this particular woman made was, "It should be required that any Black people coming from outside of the country learn about the history of African Americans." And actually, I'll extend that and say it should be required for everyone. The United States would be a different place if people really understood African American history and the struggles. I mean, it's impressive what African American culture has done to overcome and to continue to grow in these United States. So know your history. That's the first step. The second one is expand your viewpoint, right? I've talked a lot about thinking outside of yourself. You know, I guess that's this old saying of thinking outside the box, but really it's expanding your knowledge, expanding your world. Travel if you can, whether it's domestically or internationally. A lot of people say, well, why do I want to do that? Why do I want to go out of my space? Why do I want to eat any foods that are different than the foods I have? Why do I want to be different? Well, you don't have to. That's your choice. But to have better understanding and better communication with a broader breadth of people, it takes that empathy, and it helps you to be empathetic, to step outside of the world that you're used to and do something a little different. So that's step 2, expand your viewpoint. And step 3, I would say, resist the tools of the oppressor. So, you know, when people come to the United States from other places, they're leaving their oppressor. So there still is oppression where they're going to, most likely, right? But what they've left is the prison of the mind. They no longer have the block that they may have grown up with when they were forming their identity that kept them locked down. So I encourage you to do that as well. And when you expand your viewpoint, that happens automatically. So learning different cultures, knowing different people, accepting the different things, being more open, those help you resist the tools of the oppressor. Some of the tools of the oppressor would be, for instance, as an Afro-Latina, when I came to undergrad, and I still have it happen, you know, my African American friends think, what is that food that you're eating? Why do you talk like that? Why are you so proper? This is strange clothing that you're wearing. Why do you listen to this music? Those seem like nothing, but they are microaggressions. And it's very harmful for the person who is experiencing them, especially if they look like you and they think they're like you. They want to be like you, but you're not accepting them. Eventually, they may not try any longer. So those are the three things I will leave you with. Know your history, expand your viewpoint, and resist tools of the oppressor. Thank you for being part of my What is Culture presentation and how it can make a difference in your life. I hope you start making a difference today.